he's just lived this incredible life.
Incredible.
Clint Eastwood, America's stone-faced cowboy, the ultimate tough guy. But what if everything you thought you knew was a lie? On his podcast, Joe Rogan cracked the legend wide open. Behind the squint and silence lies a man haunted by anxiety, trauma, and a past filled with emotional scars. He's not who you think he is, Rogan warns. From broken family bonds to a desperate need for control, the truth is darker and more human than Hollywood ever showed. What happens when the cowboy myth falls apart? You're about to find out. Because Clint Eastwood is not what we've been told. The face of American toughness or a mask. For decades, Clint Eastwood stood tall as the symbol of American masculinity. The squint, the snarl, the low, growling voice that barely needed to say a word. He was Dirty Harry, the man with no name, the cowboy who never flinched, never cracked, and never cried. To millions, he wasn't just acting tough. He was tough. He became the face of grit, the man who didn't blink even when the world burned around him. But in a surprising moment on Joe Rogan's podcast, the mask started to slip. "He's not who you think he is," Rogan said plainly. What followed wasn't gossip. It was a portrait of Eastwood few had seen. Deep emotional scars, crushing anxiety, a lifetime of emotional distance. It was a jarring contrast to the invincible characters he played. The man who never broke character on screen was, in real life, breaking under the weight of his own silence. Rogan didn't paint Eastwood as weak. Quite the opposite. He painted him as human. He's been carrying pain his whole life, Rogan shared. That stoic thing, it's not an act, it's a shield. Behind the scenes, Eastwood battled panic attacks, perfectionism, and a desperate need to stay in control. His silence wasn't strength, it was survival. And suddenly, all those silent stares and clenched jaws made a lot more sense. Because what happens when the cowboy myth is built on trauma, not toughness? What if Dirty Harry's cold eyes weren't about justice, but fear? This is where the myth begins to crack. And when it does, we don't just find a hero, we find a boy who never stopped running. That stoic thing? It's not an act, it's a shield. Joe Rogan. But to understand the man Clint Eastwood became, we have to start at the very beginning. Not on a movie set, but in the uncertain dust of the Great Depression. Haunted by roots. Clint Eastwood was born in 1930 in the shadow of America's darkest economic hour. The Eastwoods weren't the picture-perfect family some later claimed. Clint moved constantly as a child, up to 10 different schools. It wasn't just the instability of poverty. It was a deep, rootless existence that shaped the rest of his life. He learned early not to get too close to anyone. He felt like an outsider in his own story. School was never home. Friendships didn't last. There were no long routes, only short stops. And in that constant movement, Eastwood developed what many would later call emotional distance. But it wasn't distance by choice. It was protection. He learned to rely on himself. He became a lone wolf before he could drive a car. At home, the atmosphere was strict. His father, a factory worker, pushed hard. There was no softness, no warmth, just expectations. You worked, you kept your head down, you didn't complain. These weren't just household rules, they were survival tools. But they also cut deep. You grow up fast when there's no one to catch you, a family friend once said of Clint's early years. That's when the seeds of the Eastwood myth were planted. The quiet kid, the observer, the drifter. He didn't learn how to express his feelings. He learned how to bury them. And it would take decades for the world to realize that the strong, silent type wasn't just a role. It was the only way he knew how to live. You grow up fast when there's no one to catch you. Family friend. But Hollywood wasn't about to hand him a role just because he looked the part. In fact, Clint's early years in the industry were full of doors slammed in his face, and the pain of not being good enough. Early rejection and the fun of not being good enough. Clint Eastwood didn't walk into Hollywood and take over. Far from it. When he first signed with Universal Studios, he thought his break had come. But within 18 months, they cut him loose. The reason? He can't act. Just like that, the dream crumbled. It was the first of many brutal wake-up calls in a town that chews up ambition without mercy. He didn't go home. He hustled. He took whatever jobs paid the bills. Lifeguard, grocery clerk, firefighter. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept him afloat. The rejection from Universal lingered like a bruise. Every time he clocked into a new odd job, it whispered, "You weren't good. Enough." And the pain didn't disappear. It hardened him. It taught him not to expect kindness. His first acting gigs were almost insulting. Blink and you'll miss it roles, uncredited extras, nameless background characters, no lines, no presence. One early credit listed him simply as lab technician. That was Clint Eastwood, the future icon, reduced to a face in the crowd. He was chasing a dream that didn't want him. But maybe that's why he clung to it so tightly when success finally came. Because he knew what it felt like to be thrown away. The sting of early failure never left him, biographer Patrick McGilligan noted. It became part of his DNA, and it showed in the way he took control of his future, refusing to let anyone else decide his worth again. The sting of early failure never left him, Patrick McGilligan. But even as his career began to rise, something darker followed close behind, a storm inside his chest that no fame could silence. Anxiety, grief, and the sudden death that would change Clint Eastwood forever. Anxiety, isolation, and a father's sudden death. Clint Eastwood may have looked calm on screen, but inside he was anything but. Joe Rogan revealed that Eastwood had been battling anxiety since his earliest roles. During the filming of Joe Kidd in 1972, the pressure hit so hard it nearly crushed him. He suffered a severe anxiety attack, so intense he considered quitting. For a man who always played unbreakable, the fear of breaking was very real. The world never knew. Clint hid it well, burying panic behind a steely stare and a tough walk. But those close to him noticed the signs. Tension in his jaw, silence at dinner, the way he micromanaged every detail on set. It wasn't confidence, Rogan explained. It was fear. He needed everything perfect, so nothing inside him would crack. Then came the blow he never saw coming. His father died suddenly of a heart attack. Clint was devastated. The man who had shaped his discipline, who demanded control and toughness, was gone in an instant. Friends say Clint didn't cry. He didn't talk. He just worked more. It was grief without expression. A deep wound sealed in silence. That loss changed him. He became obsessed with control, from his diet to his scripts to his directing style. It wasn't ego, it was defense. That grief forged his coldness, one crew member recalled. He wasn't trying to be mean. He was trying not to fall apart. For Eastwood, control wasn't about power. It was about not drowning in pain. He wasn't trying to be mean. He was trying not to fall apart. Film crew member. As Clint took more control behind the camera, his obsession only deepened. What looked like professionalism was, in truth, armor. The need to control wasn't just about filmmaking, it was about keeping the chaos at bay. Behind the camera, on every set. By the time Clint Eastwood was directing films, he had developed a reputation, not just as a filmmaker, but as a force. Patrick McGilligan's biography painted the picture clearly. Clint was obsessed with control. He ran his sets like a general, quiet, stern, absolute. People were hired and fired without warning. If you crossed him, you disappeared. No drama, just gone. He wasn't loud or aggressive. He didn't need to be. His silence was sharper than shouting. "You didn't argue with Clint," said one former assistant director. "You just did what he wanted." There were no debates, no delays. He kept shooting days short, demanded 1 or 2 takes, and edited the films himself. This wasn't just efficiency, it was emotional protection. Joe Rogan had a theory. "He hates chaos," Rogan said. "That guy has to be the calm in the storm." Eastwood's control wasn't arrogance, it was survival. After a lifetime of unpredictability, from childhood poverty to industry rejection, the only way he could feel safe was by running the show. Chaos reminded him of fear, so he cut it out completely. But control has its price. It isolates. It makes closeness hard. When you never let anything surprise you, you also keep people out. Eastwood's sets worked like machines, but behind the scenes, relationships suffered. Even in his personal life, that same tight grip led to distance, secrecy, and emotional fallout. Because the thing about control, it doesn't heal pain, it just hides it. That guy has to be the calm in the storm, says Joe Rogan. And nowhere did that need for control and the emotional fallout that came with it show more than in his family life. 8 children, multiple affairs, and a legacy as tangled as it is fractured. 8 children, multiple affairs. Clint Eastwood is a father at least 8 times over, but his family tree reads more like a mystery novel than a family album. Several of his children were born from affairs, some of which overlapped. 2 daughters, Kimber and Lori, didn't even know he was their father until adulthood. For a man so in control of his image, his private life was messy, scattered, and complicated. Critics have called his love life reckless. Multiple long-term relationships, sudden breakups, hidden paternity. But those who know him say it wasn't about lust. It was about distance, emotional detachment. "He didn't want to be tied down emotionally," said a former partner. "He didn't know how to be close, so he kept moving." It wasn't love that failed him. It was connection. Some of his children, like Allison and Scott, found their way into his orbit. Others grew up with little contact. The relationships were inconsistent, brief moments of bonding followed by long silences. Publicly, Clint rarely speaks about his kids. Privately, those who have tried to reach out describe a man who keeps one hand open and one foot out the door. Joe Rogan summed it up in one haunting sentence. "He's always running from something, maybe even himself." The legend who never flinched in a gunfight flinched at fatherhood. He may have built an empire, but emotionally, it was on shaky ground. And when your house is built on silence, the cracks eventually show. He's always running from something, maybe even himself. Joe Rogan. And for one daughter, Kimber Eastwood, those cracks weren't just emotional, they were personal. Her story reveals the price of being related to a legend who never learned how to be a dad. The daughter's story. Kimber Eastwood didn't grow up with a last name that opened doors. She grew up with questions. For years, she didn't even know Clint was her father. When she found out, it wasn't through a loving reunion. It was a quiet revelation that came with silence, not warmth. And even after the truth was out, the relationship never fully took shape. She tried to get close. She asked to be in his films, hoping work might open a door that blood hadn't. "Maybe," he told her, but the roles never came. Kimber has spoken publicly about her father with caution, respectful, even protective. But behind the calm words, there's a sadness that's hard to miss. She wanted connection. What she got was distance. Their bond was never simple. Kimber described it as hot and cold, brief flashes of attention followed by long periods of silence. There were moments when Clint seemed interested, but they never lasted. "He keeps people at arm's length," she once told a friend, even his own kids. She wasn't angry. She wasn't heartbroken. To the public, Clint Eastwood is a father of many. But to Kimber, he was more like a shadow, always there in name, but rarely in presence. Her story is a quiet tragedy, not because of public scandal, but because of emotional absence. A daughter who wanted to matter. A father who didn't know how to show it. He keeps people at arm's length, even his own kids. Kimber Eastwood. And while his family struggled to find their place in his heart, Clint's public image took center stage again, this time wrapped in war, patriotism, and controversy. War hero or war critic? In 2014, Clint Eastwood directed American Sniper, the story of Chris Kyle, the deadliest marksman in U.S. military history. The film was a box office hit, but it split the public. Some saw it as a tribute to American soldiers. Others accused it of glorifying war. Suddenly, Eastwood wasn't just a director. He was a lightning rod in America's culture war. Eastwood defended the film. "It's not about war," he said. "It's about the cost of war." And Joe Rogan agreed. On his podcast, he praised Eastwood's vision, saying, "He showed the pain, not the pride, but the backlash revealed something deeper. People didn't really know where Clint stood. Was he the cowboy with a gun, or the man haunted by violence?" The truth, as always, was more complicated. Eastwood had always played tough men, but in real life he avoided labels. He'd supported both conservative and liberal causes. He was a registered Republican who opposed wars. He spoke out against unnecessary violence, but made movies filled with it. And that contradiction left people confused. But maybe that confusion is the point. Eastwood never promised clarity, only honesty. "His movies aren't black and white," said Rogan. "They're gray, like him." Whether hero or critic, Eastwood's true voice was somewhere in the silence between gunshots. A director not of war, but of the emotional wreckage it leaves behind. He showed the pain, not the pride. Joe Rogan. And it's in that emotional wreckage where Joe Rogan makes his boldest claim, that the lone cowboy we all watched growing up is just a wounded child, still lost in the dust of his past. Joe Rogan's theory. To Rogan, the answer is simple but tragic. Clint Eastwood's iconic toughness, that cold, unshakable silence. It wasn't a performance, it was a scar. "The guy's been through stuff," Rogan said, "and he never got over it." From an emotionally distant father to a lifetime of rejection, Rogan believes Eastwood built a persona to survive, not to thrive. Look at the characters he played. The gunslinger who doesn't speak, the cop who walks alone, the vigilante who trusts no one. Rogan connects those roles to Clint's own history. The rootless boy who moved from school to school, the man who couldn't stay close to his own kids, the lover who never stayed long. "It's not toughness," Rogan said. "It's survival." The theory cuts deep. The very image that made Clint a legend was born from emotional pain. His silence? It wasn't confidence, it was fear of being hurt. His control? Not power, but panic. The cowboy rides alone because, from the start, he was alone. And that's not a role. That's reality. It's a chilling idea that the strong, silent hero we all looked up to was just trying to hold himself together. But maybe that's why we believed in him so deeply. Because even when he said nothing, we saw the truth in his eyes. A man haunted by things he couldn't fix. Not a myth, just a man. It's not toughness, it's survival. Joe Rogan. And as we peel back the final layers of this myth, one truth remains. Clint Eastwood didn't just carry the burden of fame. He carried the burden of being a father, a symbol, and a man who never stopped running from his own shadow. The silent burden of fame and fatherhood. Fame can build you up, but it can also shut you down. As Clint Eastwood's career soared, something else began to fade: emotional connection. The more he became a household name, the more distant he became from the people who shared his name. His children describe a father who was present in title, but not in time, not in tenderness. There were no bedtime stories, no heart-to-hearts. Clint's parenting style was cold, hands-off, and strictly practical. "He wasn't the kind of dad who gave hugs," said one of his children. "He gave directions." He didn't raise them with affection. He raised them with structure. And for some, that structure felt like absence. Scott Eastwood, one of his most visible sons, tried to bridge the gap through work. He followed in his father's footsteps, acting, performing stunts, living with that famous last name. "We didn't have a normal relationship," Scott admitted. "We connected more through movies than anything else." He wasn't bitter, but the hurt was there, just under the surface. Across the Eastwood family, that emotional gap lingers. Some kids found their own paths. Others got lost in the silence. It wasn't abuse. It wasn't violence. It was just emptiness. And in a world that sees Eastwood as larger than life, the quiet truth was harder to hear. Fame built his image, but it left his family reaching for a man who never reached back. "We connected more through movies than anything else." Scott Eastwood. But beneath the tough shell and silent years, there's a side of Clint Eastwood few people ever talk about. A side that gives, quietly, humbly, and never asks for credit. The philanthropist. Few people know. For all his stoic silence, Clint Eastwood has a surprisingly generous heart, but you'd never hear it from him. He doesn't do charity press releases. He doesn't pose with giant checks. Instead, he gives quietly, without applause. In his hometown of Carmel, California, his legacy isn't on a movie screen. It's in the dirt and trees he helped save. He once bought a large piece of land near the Carmel River. Developers wanted to turn it into condos. Clint turned it into housing for seniors and preserved it as open space. Locals still thank him for it. "He saved our town's soul," said one longtime resident, and he never made a big deal about it. He also restored the Mission Ranch, an old dairy farm destined for demolition. Instead of tearing it down, Clint transformed it into a peaceful retreat with music, food, and local history. He gave the community something lasting, something quiet, just like him. No press tour, no speeches, just action. Maybe this is where his love lives, not in words or affection, but in the things he protects. The land, the history, the silence. His truest acts of love, one friend said, are the ones he doesn't talk about. And maybe that's the part of him we should look at more often. Not the cowboy with the gun, but the man planting trees where bullets used to fly. His truest acts of love are the ones he doesn't talk about. Friend of Eastwood. And as time passed, one son emerged not just to carry the Eastwood name, but to reshape what it means. A new face, a new energy, a softer strength. Scott Eastwood. Scott Eastwood didn't just inherit his father's jawline, he inherited the weight of that name. Growing up in Clint's long shadow wasn't easy, but Scott never tried to escape it. Instead, he embraced it, on his own terms. He didn't want to be a copy. He wanted to understand the man behind the myth. Their relationship was never conventional. There were no father-son camping trips, no emotional bonding over dinner. Instead, they worked together. That was our language, Scott explained. We connected through the craft. On set, they spoke in glances and edits, not hugs and heart-to-hearts. But sometimes that was enough. Joe Rogan praised Scott for his humility and emotional openness, traits his father rarely showed. In interviews, Scott talks candidly about loss, growth, and the need to express vulnerability. It's almost like he's doing the emotional work Clint never could. He's the sequel Clint never acted in, one reporter said. Same spirit, different soul. And maybe that's the legacy Clint never expected to leave. Not just a body of work, but a son who carries the burden of silence with more softness, more grace. Scott doesn't break the Eastwood mold. He evolves it, and in doing so, he gives the legend a second chance, through empathy, not stoicism. We connected through the craft. Scott Eastwood, so when we strip away the icon, the movies, the myth, what's left? Not a hero, not a villain, just a man, broken, brilliant, and unforgettable. The man behind the myth, a legacy rewritten. Joe Rogan didn't destroy the Clint Eastwood myth. He he reshaped it. Through stories, observations, and raw honesty, he showed us the man behind the badge, the cowboy behind the squint. Eastwood isn't just a screen legend. He's a study in contradictions, cold but caring, distant but devoted, broken but unbreakable. He was never perfect. He failed his family in ways that can't be undone. He built walls around his emotions so high that even love had trouble climbing in. But he also gave, healed, created, and endured. He survived what others couldn't. And he did it without asking anyone to feel sorry for him. His movies are filled with pain, justice, silence, and rage, because he was filled with all of those things. From Dirty Harry to William Money, he poured his struggles into every role. Not to hide from them, but to give them a voice, even if he couldn't say the words himself. Clint Eastwood's legacy will always be part legend. But now, thanks to voices like Joe Rogan's and to the people brave enough to tell the truth, it's also human, not spotless, not mythic, but real. And maybe that's why it lasts. Because the cowboy who never cried turns out to be just like the rest of us, flawed, afraid, and still trying. The cowboy rides alone because he was always alone. Joe Rogan, the cowboy always rode alone, but maybe not by choice. Joe Rogan's revelations don't destroy Clint Eastwood's legacy. They give it depth. They peel away the legend and show us a man who built walls to survive, a man who feared chaos more than gunfire. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes his story even more powerful. Not the myth, not the mask, but the man behind it all. If you thought you knew Clint Eastwood, think again. Because the real story is just beginning. And sometimes the strongest silence comes from the loudest pain. This is the truth they never told you.